الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين سيما بقية الله في الأرضين روحي وأرواح العالمين له الفداء. Dear brothers, and if there are any sisters as well, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I hope you're all keeping well. It is a pleasure to discuss this morning, morning for me, continuation of our previous class that we had about 3 months ago on the socio-political role of the Ahlul Bayt, salamullahi alayhim ajma'een. At any time, if the voice becomes unclear or cuts off, please message me. I don't know how good my internet is, but I hope you can all hear me clearly right now. Just give me a go ahead on the chat. Yeah, okay. Okay, inshallah, I'm going to start. Basically, as we had said those of you who may have been here in the previous class 3 months ago, we spoke about how the role of the Ahlul Bayt, salamullahi alayhim, the role of the Imams, alayhimus salam, one of their very important roles that we believe in as Shias is that they were supposed to have that role of leading the Muslim society. It was not just a responsibility for them to teach the Quran and teach the Islamic teachings, which of course they did do, but there was another role that they were, for the most part, deprived from, other than Amirul Mu'mineen in those few years that he ruled, and if we can say Imam al-Hassan as well, maybe for a very short time. The Ahlul Bayt were deprived from that other responsibility of leading the Muslim Ummah. But as we spoke about in that last class that we had a few months ago, when they were not allowed to rule and when that right of theirs was taken away from them, what did they do? Did they just sit down and engage themselves and busy themselves with other actions? No, that's incorrect. The reality, as is very clear, is that they took steps towards returning the Muslim Ummah to its ideal state. That is to say, they took steps to take back that right for them, to overthrow, to slowly prepare the grounds to overthrow the unjust and oppressive governments and themselves become, as they were supposed to be, the leaders of the society. And so this is something that we can see very clearly. It's unfortunately something that has been maybe somehow misrepresented, and a lot of the Shia community is has a misconception in this regard. They see the Imams alayhimus salam as being quietist individuals, especially from the fourth Imam onwards. They see the Imams as being quietists who sat and did lots of dua and did lots of apolitical teaching, and that's it. Whereas that's not the case. One very clear proof for that is the fact that all of the Imams lived lives of difficulty, under oppression, put in jail. One by one, they were killed. Does it make any sense that a very apt and capable and strong, smart leader, such as Harun al-Rashid, la'natullahi alayh, that he would put Imam al-Kadhim in prison and therefore put himself in a lot of risk and a lot of danger? At the time of Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam, the Shia community is very big and very strong. A lot of people love Imam al-Kadhim. Why would Harun put himself in so much danger and earn the hatred of so many Muslims by putting the Imam in jail? Why? Because he knows that the Imam is a threat to him. He knows that if the Imam has the chance, he would overthrow Harun and take over and take the reins of leadership for himself. So unfortunately, this very heated and strong and dangerous political struggle that the Imams engaged in is something that has been distorted and hidden from the Shia community. That reality that was known to the Khulafa, such as Mansur or Harun or Ma'mun, it was very clear to them. They knew who the Imam was, what the Imam wanted to do. That same reality has been hidden from Muslims and even Shias today. We spoke about different reasons for that, and very quickly, a few of the reasons are that one thing is that these things are not everything that the Imams were doing in a political sense was explicitly written down in history. You can imagine that if the Shia community was carrying out undercover secret organizations and smuggling money and preparing their political resistance, they wouldn't be writing all that down. In particular, if the history was being written by the victors, as we normally have, I think it's a proverb or a phrase in English that history is written by those that win, by the victors. The Shia community were always living under oppression and they were not the victors, so you would not expect them to be narrating these details and writing everything down. Another reason why this was distorted and hidden from the Shia community is that there are undoubtedly fabricated narrations that, for example, I very briefly mentioned, I think, in the previous class, that there are fabricated narrations that portray some of the Imams as being very, very weak and humble and abasing themselves before the oppressive leader. Whereas those ahadith are countered by other ahadith that portray a very different image. And if somebody who is an expert does some work, as some of our experts have done, it becomes very clear that those first group of ahadith that show the Imam in a very weak and humble light, those ahadith, many of them, if not all of them, are fabricated. You see, the Banu al-Abbas, they had a vested interest in portraying the Imams like this. They knew that the Imams were people that were loved. So they wanted to show people or trick people into thinking that the Imams were people who loved us. They loved the Banu al-Abbas. They had no problem with us. So therefore, if Shias heard that, they would also not have a problem. Another very important reason that has been a cause for people to be negligent and heedless of this political movement of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam is that the Imams lived at different times and in different situations. As I also spoke about in the previous class, the time of the Banu al-Umayyah was very, very different from the time of the Banu al-Abbas. The Banu al-Abbas, when they first came to power, they knew the Shia community inside out. They were people who used to be working side by side with the Imams. They knew who the Imams were, they knew who the companions of the Imams were. So therefore the Imams had to exercise a very high degree of taqiyya. Taqiyya meaning not that they gave up on their overall political agenda, no. Taqiyya meaning that they took prudent and wise steps to hide some of what they were doing in order to not make everything be lost, the whole movement be wiped out and lost. So basically, because some of the Imams took different steps of action and some of them engaged in a political struggle in different ways, the overall results of there being a political struggle was at sometimes hidden. But anyways, what we spoke about in the previous class, for those of you who were there, was that we went through some of the ahadith that illustrate the interactions of the Imams alayhimus salam with the Khulafa, the oppressive Khulafa, to show how the Imams took a very strong stance and the Khulafa were very scared of the Imams. The Khulafa, in many cases, they knew and they very explicitly told the Imam, we know that you, Ahlul Bayt, always want to cause problems for us. And the Imams didn't deny it. Or other times, the Khulafa, they burnt down the house of Imam Sadiq, or they put the Imams in jail, or Imam al-Kadhim was running from town to town on the run from the government. So that kind of relationship that illustrates the political struggle with the Khulafa, that was one of the things we discussed in the last class. Also, another very important discussion that we kind of briefly illustrated was how the Imams interacted with the Shia community. How the Imams grew and nurtured the Shia community. After the Shia community was effectively destroyed after Karbala, we see that generation after generation, the Shia community grew bigger and stronger. The Imams had representatives, they had money being smuggled back and forth, they had a very intricate and very organized system. We showed how the Imams were busy spreading the message of the Ahlul Bayt, how the Imams were not denying when the time came and people asked them about their political agenda, they didn't even deny it. So that was all what we discussed in the month of December 2019. Inshallah, in this week and the following week, what we want to look at is some of the interaction that the Imams had with some of the ulama, in particular ulama who are working for the government of that time, and how the Imams very strongly rebuked them. That's what we want to look at today. Also, one example of the Imam or two examples of the Imams and some of the poets. Again, a very important tool to fulfill a political agenda at that time was to make use of poetry. And then inshallah next week we will look a little bit at an example of some of the revolutionaries. Perhaps you are aware that during the time of the 5th Imam up until the 11th Imam, there were many Imamzades or descendants of the Imams that launched armed rebellions against the Banu Umayyah and Banu al-Abbas. So we want to look at some of those, in particular the example of Zayd, the son of Imam Sajjad. We will talk a bit about him and what was the stance of the Imams towards him, what was his stance toward the Imams, and we will try to see as a result what some of the political roles of the Imams were. I just want to make sure that you can hear me clearly, and if you have any questions, please feel free to type. Okay, so inshallah, with that, we will start with today's discussion. Like I said, is we want to talk a little bit about some of the ulama and the poets at that time and how the Imams interacted with them. First of all, a little bit of a background and a word about the important role that both of these professions held in that day and age. So, ulama in those days were the ideological and cultural leaders of society. You see, Muslims at that time, they had that correct attitude of wanting to see everything in the light that the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw it. Muslims were very eager to know, what did the Prophet say about a matter? What did he say about an individual? What did he say about a verse of Quran? So naturally, those people who were able to quote the ahadith of the Holy Prophet and therefore teach people what Islam and what the Prophet said about a matter, they held a lot of influence in society. They had a certain kind of control and authority over the minds and the hearts of the people. Therefore, it's no secret that such ulama could be a very important tool to gain control over people. And it was a tool that people like Muawiyah used very effectively. Basically, what Muawiyah la'natullahi alayhi did is he took people who had no status and they were not great individuals and he lifted their status. He made them to be an alim and a scholar in the eyes of the people. He made them to be the government scholar, the number one authority on Islam. People like famous individuals whom you probably heard about, like Ka'ab al-Ahbar. Ka'ab al-Ahbar was a Jewish rabbi. He didn't even live at the time of the Prophet. He converted to Islam during the time of the second caliph. But under Muawiyah, he became a very important narrator of hadith. Also Abu Huraira, same thing. In the time of Muawiyah, he became a very important narrator of hadith. Today, many of the books of our brothers from the Ahl Sunnah have a hadith that are narrated from Ka'ab al-Ahbar or Abu Huraira. What did these scholars do? What was the effect that these scholars could have? Let me give you two ahadith that they narrated to give you an idea. To sum it up, what these scholars could do for Muawiyah, for the Banu Umayyah, for the Banu al-Abbas, was that they could legitimize their government. They could justify the oppression that they were doing. They could hide all the oppression that was being done. In one of the ahadith that is narrated in Sahih al-Bukhari and in some of the books of ahadith of the Sunnis, it says the following, that عن النبي صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم قال من كره من أميره شيئا فليصبر, that the Holy Prophet صلى الله عليه وآله said, whoever detests something from his leader, he should have patience over it. فإنه من خرج من السلطان شبرا مات ميتة جاهلية. That hadith doesn't even just stop there, that forged and fake hadith. It doesn't even stop there. It goes on to say that anybody who rises up one shibr, one span of a hand, one small amount basically, if they rise up against their leader, they will die a death of ignorance, a death of jahiliyyah. You can see what kind of effect that has, that when people hear these kind of ahadith, they become complacent, they become quiet in the face of oppression. They feel that God wants us to bear this oppressive situation of Yazid and Muawiyah and Abdul Malik and all the oppression that they used to do. Even further than that, like I said, one of the other things that the ahadith were used for were to introduce to the Muslim community what the Holy Prophet thought about an individual or a family. In another hadith narrated by, guess who? Amr bin As. We all know Amr bin al-As was not a very good person. He was somebody who fought against Amir al-Mu'mineen. But Muslims at that time didn't know that. They thought that he was a companion of the Prophet. He was a governor of the Caliph in Egypt. He used to lead namaz. He narrated a hadith, obviously a fabrication, where he said that the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Inna ala Abi Talib laysu li bi awliya," that the family of Abu Talib, the children of Abu Talib, are not my awliya. They are not my. Here, awliya doesn't mean friends. It means like my party, or my group that I am with. No, I'm not friends. I'm not in the same group as the family of Abu Talib. So this is what the role of scholars were in that day and age. Scholars could be very effectively used to support haqq, or as they were being used by Muawiyah and the likes of Muawiyah, to support batil. Another very, very effective force at that time and later on, and maybe even till today in many societies, is poetry. Poetry has an ability to touch people in their heart. It is almost like a miracle in a way that it can really, really beautifully express very deep ideas or very powerful ideas, especially in a culture where people have a love for that language and they have a love for poetry, as was the case in those days in Arabia. As we know, in that day and age, in the time even before Islam, there were many, many poets. And the most eloquent of all Arabic poetry was written in that day and age. There was a group of qasaid, or a group of poems known as al-mu'allaqat. There are different theories of why they are known as mu'allaqat. One of them is that they used to be hung on the Kaaba itself. These are poems that were written before Islam, but till now they are known as some of the most beautiful and eloquent Arabic poetry. In that culture, in that day and age, everybody would recite poetry. Men, women, kids. There's a funny story that illustrates that one of the poets of the Ahlul Bayt, one of the great Shias who used to write poetry in favor of the Ahlul Bayt during the time of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam, he composed a beautiful poem, and he made a promise to himself that I won't recite it to anybody except to the Imam. And in a famous story, also this story is very beautifully illustrated in the movie of Imam al-Rida that Iran has produced. Da'bal comes before Imam al-Rida alayhi salam, he recites the poem, and Imam al-Rida at the end of it, he adds 2 lines of poetry about himself. But the point that I wanted to say is this, that when when Di'bal left the company of Imam al-Rida and he started to head back towards the city of Qum, he was robbed on the way. His caravan that he was in was robbed. As they were being robbed and pillaged, one of the thieves was reciting that very same poem of Di'bal. And it turns out that they were Shia robbers. What kind of robbers these are, that they were Shias. But when they find out that it's Di'bal, they give back all the things that they stole and they free these people. But my point is this, that in a short span of time, that poem of Di'bal had circulated around the Shia community. So much so that a robber on the road is reciting that same poem. That was the love that people had for poetry. So now inshallah we want to look at how the Imams alayhimussalam used these two different tools or two different classes of society for their own political agenda. So first of all, we have a story of the fifth Imam alayhi salam. There was a scholar, a famous faqih in the city of Mecca who was a student of Ibn Abbas. His name was Ikramah. He was a North African. He's a very famous faqih and muhaddith. Again, many of the books of our brothers in the Ahlul Sunnah, even today, they narrate a hadith from Ikramah, especially in tafsir. So Ikramah would be narrating from people such as Ibn Abbas. So there's a story that one day in the Hajj, Ikramah sees that there is a young man who has the signs of taqwa and of a very great personality. He doesn't know who he is, and so he asks that who is this man? And they tell him, oh, you don't know, this is Muhammad, the son of Imam Sajjad, Muhammad ibn Ali, alayhim as-salam. And Ikramah, who's somebody who has studied under Ibn Abbas from the Banu Hashim, of course he knows about the Imam, he's excited. He thinks to himself that, oh wow, let me go to the Imam and let me benefit from him. As in, not in a sincere way. This was somebody, okay, I didn't say, as a introduction, I meant to say about him that Ikramah, despite being a great scholar and a student of Ibn Abbas, he was one of the government scholars. He was somebody who worked for the Banu Umayyah. He was one of their stooges who was like Ka'ab al-Ahbar, like Abu Huraira, people who are there to justify their oppression. So in an unsincere way, Ikrama is thinking that, oh wow, I can benefit from Imam Baqir alayhi salam. Let me go talk to him. Let me learn some hadith from him. Then I can tell everybody that, oh, I know this hadith from Imam Baqir. So he comes before the Imam, and then all of a sudden he begins to shake, and like he's overcome with like awe of the Imam's presence. Let me just get the actual Arabic. The Arabic that I've put here is not that part. It says فَلَمَّا مَثُلَ بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ, as Ikrama came before the Imam, ارتعدت فرائصه وأسقط في يد أبي جعفر. He started to tremble and shake, and he falls in the hands of the Imam. At this point, this is what I've put here. وَقَالَ يَا ابْنَ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ. He says to Imam Baqir alayhi salam, O son of Rasulullah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, لَقَدْ جَلَسْتُ مَجَالِسَ كَثِيرَةً بَيْنَ يَدَيْ ابْنِ عَبَّاسِ وَغَيْرِهِ فَمَا أَدْرَكَنِي مَا أَدْرَكَنِي آنِفًا. I've been in the company of great scholars before. I've been in the company of Ibn Abbas, but never once have I been overcome in awe in this kind of manner. So, what do you think the Imam's response would be to this kind of action? Did the Imam feel flattered? Did the Imam say, oh, you're so nice, you're complimenting me? No, very strongly. The Imam rebukes, criticizes him. He seizes the opportunity to show everybody and show this individual that what he's doing by working for the government is very wrong. He says, فَقَالَ لَهُ أَبُو جَعْفَرَ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامُ وَيْلَكَ, woe be upon you, يَا عُبَيْدَ أَهْلِ الشَّامِ, O small servant of the people of Sham, meaning the Banu Umayyah, إِنَّكَ بَيْنَ يَدَيِ بُيُوتٍ أَذِنَ اللَّهُ أَن تُرْفَعَ وَيُذْكَرَ فِيهَا اسْمُهُ. that, "O slave of the Banu Umayyah, O you wretched person, do you know who you in whose presence you are? You have come before somebody, before a house that Allah has given permission that His name be remembered in that house, be raised in that house." So I just want to show from this story that the Imam took a very unapologetic, very strong stance against those ulama who were working for the government. Um, okay, my voice is still clear, right? You guys are with me? Okay, the next story that we have is about poets. So again, this is a story first about Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. And one day so basically, like I said, poetry was a very, very strong tool that could be used to touch the hearts of people, to stir the emotions of people, to make people, feel and think a certain thing. And so it's something that can be used. Who's going to use the poetry in a political sense? Those people who want to benefit politically. You have the Banu Umayyah on the one hand who want to use the poets to cause people to praise them, cause people to think highly of them. On the other hand, you have the Banu Hashim, salamullahi alayhim. The Banu Hashim also can use poetry to claim their right to expose the oppression of the Banu Umayyah and to stir the emotions of people in a good way. The same way that we use our emotions in Muharram to increase our love for Imam Hussein and to stir that pure love, poetry at that time was and could have been and was used in that way. But there were also people who were hypocrites, people who pretended to be Shias, and they would recite poetry one day for the enemy and one day for the Imams. One of these individuals was somebody by the name of Kuthayyir or Kathayyir. So he comes before Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, and Imam Sadiq tells him right away, Imtadahta Abdul Malik, rebuking him. You praised Abdul Malik. The Imam says, I know that you recited poetry in favor of Abdul Malik. How could you do that? He's an enemy, he's a zalim. And Kuthayyir, he starts to give excuses before the Imam. He says, Ma qultu lahu ya Imam al-Huda. He says, Oh Imam Sadiq, I didn't call him in that poetry that I recited for Abdul Malik. I didn't address him the way I would address you. I didn't call him Imam al-Huda. I only called him Ya Asad. I called him O lion. And a lion is but a dog. I called him Ya Shams, O sun. And the sun is a inanimate object. I called him O ocean, and the ocean is dead. I called him O snake, and the snake is just like a living creature of some sort, some low creature. Anyways, he tries to apologize and give excuses before the Imam. And it says in this hadith that فَتَبَسَّمَ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ. Imam Sadiq smiled as if he knew the reality. He knew that this person was a hypocrite and that one day he's going and reciting poetry for Abdul Malik, and then he's coming to the Imam. At that time, وَأَنْشَأَ الْكُمَيْتُ بَيْنَ يَدَيْ. At that time, Kumayt, that true Shia, that lover of the Imam, somebody who gave his life for the love of the Imams, he came and recited poetry. Who was Kumayt? Kumayt was somebody during the time of the 5th Imam and 6th Imam when there was a lot of pressure on the Shia community, when nobody had the guts to come out and praise the Ahlul Bayt, and they would have been killed as Kumayt was eventually killed. Kumayt did so. He recited some beautiful, beautiful, amazing poetry that was very well received and recognized. He has a collection of poems known as Hashimiyat. In one of the lines or two of the lines of poetry that I've put here to get an idea, he says, Sasatun la kaman yara. He's talking about the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, that they are leaders. لا كمن يرى رعية الناس سواء ورعية الأنعام لا كعبد المليك أو كوليد أو سليمان بعد أو كهشام. You can see how brave he is. Openly by name, he's mentioning the caliphs of the Banu Umayyah, and he's saying that the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam are leaders. but not leaders like these Bani Umayyah who, for them, it's the same whether they are leading people or animals. They treat people like animals. And then one by one, he begins to name them. This was Kumayt. In one of the ahadith, we have that uh, Imam Sadiq, Imam Baqir alayhi salam, after he hears one of the poems of Kumayt, he does dua for Kumayt 3 times. He does dua for him, and then he gives a gift of 100,000 dirhams. That was a huge sum at that time. At that time, when the Shia community was not even that rich. Those of you who were here in my last class, you might remember that I talked about how the Shia community grew. Later on, the time of the 10th Imam, 11th Imam, the Shia community was big and rich and they had lots of money. But in those days, the 5th Imam's time, the Shia community was still small, under a lot of oppression, poverty, and the Imam gives 100,000 dirhams to Kumayt. It shows that the Imam supported this kind of very dangerous political resistance against the Banu Umayyah. Okay, with that, we come to the last discussion that we want to have, the last story or hadith that we want to give to illustrate what we want to talk about today. That is a story to do with a very famous individual a very famous Sunni scholar, a Sunni narrator of hadith known as Muhammad bin Muslim az-Zuhri. Just as a point, this is very different from the Muhammad bin Muslim, the companion of the 5th and 6th Imam, one of our very, very important Shia narrators of hadith, who the books of ahadith are full of Shia narrations from him, is somebody called Muhammad bin Muslim. This is somebody else who lived before. His name was Muhammad bin Muslim az-Zuhri. One of his ancestors was also known as Shahab. So he's also known as Muhammad bin Shahab az-Zuhri. He was a famous faqih and a narrator of hadith. He lived in the city of Medina. He studied under companions of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he was well known. At that time, everybody recognized him as a very, very smart scholar, an expert in Islam. For example, one of the later Sunni scholars who undoubtedly you've heard of, Malik bin Anas, a very important narrator of hadith and founder of the Maliki school of Sunni fiqh, he says that ma adraktu fil Medina, anyway, something like that, that I didn't find any faqih and muhaddith in the city of Medina other than Zuhri. That was the level of Zuhri. Again, to give you an idea, though, Zuhri was somebody who was working for Abdul Malik. He was, despite his amazing status as a very knowledgeable scholar, he was one of those stooges who was there to justify the oppression of Abdul Malik and help the government. To give you an idea of what kind of fabrications these ulama did and what kind of crimes they committed to justify the Banu Umayyah's rule, there's an interesting story that I can narrate in a hadith that Zuhri fabricated. We'll narrate that before we come to the main thing we want to talk about. The main thing we want to talk about is a very harsh letter that Imam Sajjad Salamullahi alayh wrote to Zuhri. But first, this hadith. So at that time, during the time of Abdul Malik bin Marwan, I think this is probably after Imam Sajjad, this during the time of Imam Baqir alayhi salam. Maybe not. Anyways, at that time, there was somebody by the name of Abdullah bin Zubair who had taken over Hijaz. Abdullah bin Zubair, probably you've heard of him. He's the son of the famous companion of the Holy Prophet Zubair, the one who fought against Amir al-Mu'mineen or was about to fight against Amir al-Mu'mineen in the Battle of Jamal. Abdullah bin Zubair, he launched an uprising against the Banu Umayyah, and for a long period of time, his uprising was successful. He ruled Makkah and Medina. His brother Mus'ab was the one who also conquered Kufa and took it away from Mukhtar. And so for a while, their government was very large and spanned a vast area of the Muslim world. Just as a side point, even though Ibn Zubair was not a good individual, he was an enemy of the Ahlul Bayt, still there was a big difference between him and Abdul Malik. at least overtly, Abdullah ibn Zubair was somebody who used to do ibadat, who grew up in a religious family. He knew a lot about Islam. He would narrate hadith. Abdul Malik and the Banu Umayyah were not even trying to look religious. They were openly drinking alcohol and, trampling upon the basic aspects of the Sharia. Just as a side point to keep in mind that there was a big difference at the end of the day between Ibn Zubayr and Abdul Malik. Nonetheless, the story is this, that Abdul Malik didn't want people to go to Hajj. Naturally, he was scared that if people from Sham would go to Hajj where Abdullah bin Zubair was in power, they might get affected by the ideas of Ibn Zubair. They might be impressed by Ibn Zubair. They may become enemies of the Banu Umayyah. So what did he do? He had his alim who worked for him called Zuhri fabricate a hadith. And so Zuhri would tell people the following. He would say that this is a hadith of the Holy Prophet. لا تشد الرحال إلا إلى ثلاثة مساجد. That, O people, the Prophet ﷺ has said, don't go out on a journey except to one of three mosques. Al-Masjid al-Haram, Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, wa Masjidi, my Masjid in Medina, wa Masjidu Bayt al-Muqaddas, and the Masjid in Jerusalem, Masjid al-Aqsa. وهو, and then he goes on to talk about the merit of Jerusalem. He says, وَهُوَ يَقُومُ لَكُمْ مَقَامَ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ. That this Masjid al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, it has the same position for you as Masjid al-Haram. وَهَذِهِ الصَّخْرَةُ الَّتِي يروى أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وضع قدمه عليها لما صعد إلى السماء تقوم لكم مقام الكعبة. That, O people, this rock, that it is narrated that the Holy Prophet ﷺ put his blessed foot on that rock before he went up for Mi'raj, that rock has the position of the Kaaba for you. What does he mean by this hadith? He means to tell people that go to Jerusalem and don't go to Mecca. Why? Because the Banu Umayyah are scared that people should go to Mecca. So they have the likes of Zuhri come and fabricate these hadith. This was the situation of the Muslim Ummah at that time, that these ulama were just working for the government in a shameless manner like this. Despite that, an interesting point about Zuhri that we see is that Zuhri was somebody who actually, even though he was working for the Banu Umayyah, he still had love for the Ahlul Bayt. He narrated many ahadith about Imam Sajjad. He would praise Imam Sajjad. He would call him Zainul Abidin. And so that gives us a very important lesson, that kind of love, if it's not coupled with action, it's not of any use. We see Imam Sajjad takes a very strong stance against Zuhri. That Zuhri, don't think that just because you love me, it's going to be enough. No, you're working for the enemy. You're helping the enemy. And that's an unforgivable crime that you are doing. Ahsan, that's not mawadda. So the main thing that I wanted to narrate to you, dear brothers and sisters, and then we end with that, is a lengthy letter. It's about 3 pages long, a letter that Imam Sajjad alayhi salam wrote to Zuhri. This is narrated in a very important book of hadith called Tuhuf al-Uqul, which is by somebody called Ali bin Shu'bah, the narrator of hadith who compiled this book. Anyways, I have this letter before me. I'll just narrate about the first page, less than a page, maybe half a page, to get an idea of how the Imam, with strength and with, like no fear, he's Ahsant. With no fear, he is addressing Muhammad bin Muslim az-Zuhri. So I'm going to read it in Arabic line by line and translate it. It says, كتابه عليه السلام إلى محمد bin Muslim az-Zuhri يعظه. His letter, that is Imam Sajjad alayhi salam's letter to Muhammad bin Muslim az-Zuhri, in which he admonishes him. Imam starts. Ahsant, it's even there in that link online that Brother Musa just sent us. So you guys can go there and read it. Nonetheless, since I had planned to read the Arabic and translate it, I'll just go ahead as I was planning to. كفانا الله وإياك من الفتن ورحمك من النار. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam starts off by saying that may Allah keep us safe from keep us and you both safe from fitna and tests. But then he says, وَرَحِمَكَ مِنَ النَّارِ. But you, Zuhri, specifically, may Allah have mercy on you from the fire. What does that mean? That means that you are somebody who is a person of the fire of hell. فَقَدْ أَصْبَحْتَ بِحَالٍ يَنْبَغِي لِمَنْ عَرَفَكَ بِهَا أَنْ يَرْحَمَكَ. Imam Sajjad is telling Zuhri that you have attained a state that anybody who knows you should have mercy on you and should feel sorry for you, basically. You might think, what is Imam saying? This is like a level 1 scholar with money, with power, working for the government. But Imam is saying that somebody who knows your reality, they would feel sorriness and feel pity for you. فَقَدْ أَثْقَلَتْكَ نِعَمُ اللَّهِ بِمَا أَصَحَّ مِنْ بَدَنِكَ وَأَطَالَ مِنْ عُمْرِكَ وَقَامَتْ عَلَيْكَ حُجَجُ اللَّهِ. He's saying that Allah has given you so many blessings. He has made your back heavy, basically, with blessings. With all what He gave you, health in your body, He gave you a long life, all these proofs that Allah has given you. بما حملك من كتابه وفقهك فيه من دينه وعرفك من سنة نبيه محمد صلى الله عليه وآله. That Allah gave you this deep understanding of the Quran. Hammalaka min kitabihi. He made you somebody who carries the Quran. He gave you a deep understanding of religion. He taught you the Sunnah. And then he goes on to now warn Zuhri that, you should remember, Zuhri, that with every blessing, there is a responsibility that comes along with it. فرض لك في كل نعمة أنعم بها عليك وفي كل حجة احتج بها عليك الفرض بما قضى. So he says that with every ni'mah that Allah has given you, with every proof that Allah has put upon you, there is also an obligation that comes with it. فَمَا قَضَى إِلَّا إِبْتَلَى شُكْرَكَ. He didn't give you anything like that. He didn't make any decree in such a way, except that He's going to test you to see, are you thankful or not? فِي ذَلِكَ وَأَبْدَى فِيهِ فَضْلَهُ عليك فقال لئن شكرتم لأزيدنكم ولئن كفرتم إن عذابي لشديد. Then he goes on to quote this verse that if you give thanks, Allah will increase you, and if you are ungrateful, then the punishment of Allah is there. Now he starts. That was till now, it was like an introduction. Now he specifically starts to attack Zuhri. He says, فَانظُرْ أَيُّ رَجُلٍ تَكُونَ غَدًا إِذَا وَقَفْتَ بَيْنَ يَدَيِ اللَّهِ. O Zuhri, think about what kind of a person, what kind of a man you are going to be tomorrow when you have to stand before Allah. فَسَأَلَكَ عَنْ نِعَمِهِ عَلَيْكَ كَيْفَ رَعَيْتَهَا. And Allah Ta'ala will ask you about His blessings. How did you use them? وَعَنْ حُجَجِهِ عَلَيْكَ كَيْفَ قَضَيْتَهَا. How did you use all of these proofs that Allah gave you? Allah gave you this knowledge of the Quran, of religion. ولا تحسبن الله قابلا منك بالتعذير ولا راضيا منك بالتقصير. Don't think that Allah will accept your apology on that day and He will be happy with you despite your shortcoming. هيهات هيهات ليس كذلك. No, it's not the case at all. And then he goes on to talk about this heavy, heavy responsibility that scholars have. Allah, he's saying, أخذ على العلماء في كتابه إذ قال لتبيننه للناس ولا تكتمونه. That basically Allah took a covenant upon these scholars when He said in the Quran that they have to explain the religion, they have to explain things to people and not hide them. And now he begins again to attack Zuhri strongly, that, O Zuhri, وَعْلَمْ أَنَّ أَدْنَى مَا كَتَمْتَ وَأَخَفَّ مَا احْتَمَلْتَ أَنْ آنَسْتَ وَحْشَةَ الظَّالِمِ وَسَهَّلْتَ لَهُ طَرِيقَ الْغَيِّ. That, O Zuhri, the least that you did, the least thing that you hid, and the least basically crime that you committed is that you gave a nice face to the oppressor and you made it easier. You like smoothened out the path for him. Basically, the Imam is saying if it was not for you, then the oppressive Banu Umayyah, Abdul Malik, they wouldn't have had that legitimacy, that respect, that honor, that kind of face in the minds of the people, because you gave it a religious flavor. You are the one who justified their crimes. And then he goes on to say, بدنوك منه حين دنوت وإجابتك له حين دعيت, because you would basically come close to him whenever he wanted, and you would respond to him, this oppressive ruler, whenever he would call you. فما أخوفني أن تكون تبوء بإثمك غدا مع الخونة. He says, "O Zuhri, I'm afraid that on tomorrow, basically on the day of judgment, you will be resurrected with because of your crime, you will be with those traitors. وأن تسأل عما أخذت بإعانتك على ظلم الظلمة." You will be asked about all that you took, all that money, all that status, all that power that you took because of helping the oppressors. إنك أخذت ما ليس لك ممن أعطاك ودنوت ممن لم يرد على أحد حقا. He says, you took what was not yours. You came close to an oppressor who didn't observe the rights of other people. Anyways, I'll leave it at that. The letter, like I said, is lengthy. But basically, as we can see from this very strong letter, that the Imam was not somebody, this image that we might have of Imam Sajjad is just staying at home and reading dua and giving people a akhlaqi maw'idha. That doesn't sit with this kind of action. The Imam was somebody who was also reminding people of their political duty, that they had to stand up and take a stance against the Banu Umayyah. Anyways, it ended a bit less. I didn't take as long as I thought I would, but inshallah, if you guys have any questions, I'm at your service right now for the next few minutes. Otherwise, inshallah, next week we will meet again and discuss. Like I said at that time, next week we want to talk about some of the Imamzadeh, some of the descendants of the Imams who launched rebellions against the Banu Umayyah, the Banu al-Abbas, and how they were with the Imams, how we should judge them, what was the Imam's view about them. Inshallah, I pray that all of this is a step towards understanding the true reality and identity of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. And I pray that Allah Ta'ala gives us the ability to not just understand who the Imams were, but live a life of obedience to them and servitude, and in a way that they would be happy with us, inshaAllah. With that, I will end. وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. I see that there are some messages that were sent to me, but I'm not exactly sure how to read them. I see an attendee chat here. If there are messages that can be sent on the public attendee chat, then feel free to send it. If it's a private message, any good books to read? About this topic, I guess you mean, right? The question is about books about this topic that discuss the social political role of the Imams, alayhimus salam. Yeah, so one of the individuals who has really opened this up in our time is Ayatollah Khamenei, and to be honest, a lot of this material that I'm presenting to you, dear brothers and sisters, I've taken from his lectures. Um, but of course, the material is in Farsi originally. However, there are efforts to translate it. For example, I know of a project to translate one of the very good books of his that's underway and maybe being completed soon. So, inshallah, eventually this material will be available in English from Ayatollah Khamenei. There is another very strong historian who lives in Iran, in the city of Qom, I'm pretty sure. His name is Aghay Pishva, Mahdi Pishva, Pishva'i. I know that when he discusses history, he also touches on this aspect. And I'm pretty sure that recently I saw my mother had sent me an email about one of his books being translated into English and being released in English. So yeah, you can look for that name, Mahdi Pishva'i. Ahsant, yeah, Sayyid Jafar al-Amili. The source for the first slide, which slide was that? The first slide was just that picture that I had in the background. Is that what the question is? Ikrama. Okay, okay. So yeah, the story of Ikrama is taken from the book Manaqib al Abi Talib of Ibn Shahr Ashub. Ibn Shahr Ashub was one of our scholars who lived, I think, in the 6th century Hijrah, and he wrote a very important book. It's a book that has a lot of historical ahadith that are very important and not narrated elsewhere. Yeah, Ahsan. So, inshallah, next week, what I want to do is spend a good chunk of time concluding and making such comments on how we can take practical lessons. But I mean, obviously, the main aspect is this, that we should, the way we look at the imams has a very deep effect on our own identity, because we see the imams as our leaders. If we see the imams as being people who are engaged in a political struggle to confront the injustice in the world and to better the world and to bring about justice in an Islamic definition of justice, of course, then that would also affect our own works and our own efforts. And yeah, inshallah, I'll try to make more points next week. Okay, if there are any other questions, please write them. Otherwise, with that, we will end. Ahsant, jazakumullah khair. I ask you to remember me and all of us in your du'as in these holy nights of Rajab. Take care. Khuda Hafiz. My pleasure. My pleasure. Khuda Hafiz.